If you're a basketball fan of a certain age, then there's a good chance that you remember Kemba Walker for being one of the most exciting and consistent guards in the NBA. After getting drafted 9th overall in 2011 by the Bobcats, Kemba went on to be a 4-time All-Star for the Hornets and Celtics, cementing his status as one of the best guards of his generation and quite possibly the best player in the history of either iteration of the Charlotte Hornets. He may not have quite risen to the heights of similar players like Damian Lillard or Kyrie Irving, but in terms of that next tier of NBA stars, there's not many guys you would have preferred to have in your team in the late 2010s and early 2020s. For younger basketball fans, that's who Kemba Walker was. But if you're even just a little older than that, your memory of Kemba Walker probably includes a time where he wasn't a tier below anybody. Because in 2011, Kemba took a UConn team that was otherwise pretty ordinary and dragged them, kicking and screaming, to both the Big East Conference Championship and ultimately the third national title in program history. In their 11-game winning streak to end the season, Cardiac Kemba scored 20 points or more in 7 of them. Unsurprisingly, off the back of that, he was voted both the most outstanding player of that tournament and a consensus first-team All-American. But more than that, he convinced an entire generation of basketball fans that it is in fact possible for one player to put a team on their back and carry them to a national title. And a decade and a half later, I think it's probably a good time to revisit that idea. Because while it is definitely fun to be nostalgic and mythologize efforts like this, I think there's a lot of value in zooming in on the details of what made them possible. Because whether we realize it or not, what we remember about these moments from the past can have a very profound effect on what we predict to happen in the future. So in this episode, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. What happened? How did it happen? And most importantly, is it actually possible for one player to win the tournament on their own? To understand what happened to UConn in 2011, we have to start with the year before, in 2010. The 2010 UConn Huskies were a team in transition. They were ranked 12th in the preseason and started off pretty strong, but tailed off hard towards the end of the season and ended up missing the tournament. One of the few bright spots was that their sophomore guard, Kemba Walker, made the all-conference team, along with freshman center Alex Oriaki. They also added new recruits, Jeremy Lamb and Shabazz Napier, in the offseason, so even if the previous season had been a disappointment, the future of the program looked pretty promising. Little did they know that that future was coming a lot sooner than they expected. The easiest way to describe the UConn Huskies in 2011 was that they simply did not make sense. Coming into the season, 9 of their 12 scholarship players were underclassmen, and while this was the one-and-done era and teams like Kentucky were dealing with that on a regular basis, this UConn team did not appear to have the level of talent to make up for that lack of experience. The coaches' poll predicted them to finish 10th in the Big East before the season started. Sports Illustrated didn't even list them in the top 68 of their preseason team rankings. It looked very much like, aside from having Kemba Walker, they were headed for another year of frustration. And yet, pretty early on, we got a pretty strong indication that that was not going to be this team's fate. At the Maui Invitational, UConn went up against Wichita State, who would eventually go on to win the NIT, Draymond Green's Michigan State, and a Kentucky team that featured 3 of the top recruits in the country. And remember those guys, because they're going to come back up later. UConn beat them all behind 3 outstanding performances from Kemba Walker, who averaged 30 points per game while shooting over 50% from the field at that tournament. We also got to see a bit of his clutch gene, which is also going to come back up again later. UConn won their first 10 games that season and got all the way to number 4 in the AP poll. But then, conference play started. And some of the weaknesses that people were identifying before the season actually started to become a problem. 2011 UConn was clearly a very good team, but they were not a particularly deep team. Kemba accounted for about a third of the team's total points on his own, and especially down the stretch, they basically had a rotation of about 7 guys who were getting most of the minutes. Combine that with the 9 underclassmen on the roster, and you've got a pretty good recipe for a bit of a mid-season rough patch. And that is exactly what ended up happening. After that 10-0 start, the Huskies lost 9 of their next 20 games, almost all of which were in conference play. To be fair to them, the Big East was an absolute nightmare that season, with 11 of its 16 teams making the tournament, and that gauntlet proved to be very, very unforgiving for a young UConn team that was still improving, but not quite quickly enough to catch up to their grueling schedule. But here's the thing about that. The regular season is a marathon and tests your endurance, both physically and mentally. But college basketball, maybe more than any other sport we have in this country, isn't built around the regular season. Instead, it's way more focused around tournaments, and in a tournament, all that stuff about stamina kind of goes out the window. If you get the right group of guys, you can pretty much get through a tournament on vibes and the power of friendship. And while I'm not going to say that that's exactly what happened with this UConn team, I'm not going to say that it isn't either. UConn came into the Big East tournament as the 9th seed, which was actually pretty close to where the coaches poll had predicted them to finish before the season. So, good job to the haters, I guess. But once that tournament started, they went back to looking like the team that had won in Maui and was ranked in the top 5. They beat DePaul pretty easily in the first round, then beat Georgetown by 17 in the second, which set up one of the most devastating step-backs in basketball history in round 3 against Pittsburgh. Kemba averaged 26 in those 3 games, by the way, and like the rest of his team, was far from being done at this tournament. The semifinal was against Syracuse, and for the second game in a row, Kemba played every minute of it, putting up 33 points and 12 rebounds in a game that went to overtime. This was not the Eric Devendorf game, by the way, which is what I thought going into this. That game was in 2009. But if you're wondering at this point, and I think it would be totally fair if you were, how a group of guys who seemed completely exhausted a couple of weeks before this were suddenly playing like the best team in America, I gotta be honest, I don't really have a great answer for you. Freshman Jeremy Lamb said that they didn't have time to be tired at that point in the season. Jim Calhoun said they were immune to pressure, both in the Big East tournament and in the first couple of rounds of the NCAA tournament. What was the real reason? Who knows? But Kemba Walker averaging 26 points, 6 rebounds, and 4 assists probably had something to do with it. He also only shot 16 3-pointers in that whole tournament, which doesn't really have anything to do with the rest of the story, but I did think it was kind of wild. Anyway, as the NCAA tournament began, a trend that had started to develop a little earlier in UConn's season then became a pretty crucial part of how it ended, and that trend's name is Jeremy Lamb. We've been treating Kemba Walker as the protagonist in this story, which is accurate, but in the NCAA tournament, Jeremy Lamb truly became the Robin to Kemba's Batman. He put up some points a few times in the regular season, but as freshmen often are, even the talented ones, he'd also been a little inconsistent. And as a result, he'd been playing about 26 minutes per game, which is still really impressive for such a young guy, but in the tournament, he played 35 minutes per game, which is almost all of the minutes. He also averaged about 14 points per game, which may not sound like a ton, but on a team like UConn, whose success was largely dependent on their defense, those 14 points went a lot further than it would have on most other teams. It was clear that by the end of that season, both Jim Calhoun and Kemba Walker had really started to trust him, and if that doesn't happen, I don't think this team ends up where it did. But anyway, back to Kemba. In the Sweet 16, UConn matched up against San Diego State and another future NBA star in Kawhi Leonard, which in one sense is just kind of a fun thing that happened, but it's also an interesting parallel for what happened to Kawhi and the Spurs 3 years later. In 2014, Kawhi was the one breaking out and winning Finals MVP against LeBron and the Heat, but in 2011, Kemba and UConn were on the run of their lives, and San Diego State was just the next team in their way. And of the 74 points that UConn scored in that game, Kemba and Jeremy Lamb scored 60 of them. Their next opponents were the other hottest team in the tournament, and Derek Williams in Arizona. But UConn did their thing, held Arizona to 39% from the field, and moved on to the Final Four. This team reaching the Final Four was already well past what anyone could have expected before the season started. But if they wanted to get any further, they would have to win a rematch against John Calipari's Kentucky. And I think this is a really interesting matchup to revisit because these two teams were kind of mirror images of each other, with one very notable exception. Like UConn, Kentucky also had a very young team, also only played about 8 guys, and also got off to a hot start before falling off once conference play started. And then their young team started figuring things out, won their conference tournament, and wound up playing their best basketball when it mattered most. If you think about it, this could have pretty easily been a story about how Kentucky won an unlikely national title instead of UConn. I actually think this UConn team provides a really interesting insight into what could have happened if any one of Calipari's Kentucky teams had had a veteran player like Kemba Walker on them. But as they did not, and UConn did, the Huskies advanced to the national title game behind 18 from Kemba, some intense defense, and 2 incredibly clutch free throws late from Shabazz Napier. So after all of that, all of the doubt before the season started, all the difficulties in conference play, all the close games in the 2 tournaments, you'd have to imagine that the championship game, the last game of that incredible season, would be the icing on the cake, right? That game's probably going to be really exciting, right? Wrong. Very wrong, in fact. If I'm honest, that game against Butler is on my shirt because I got this at a thrift store in Tuscaloosa while I was in college, was probably one of the worst games of basketball I've ever watched. In the most important game of the season, the two teams combined to shoot 26% from the field. Woof. And I don't just say that because both teams have dog mascots. Jim Calhoun praised this game as a showcase of elite defense, and while I would normally defer to his 40 years of Division I coaching experience, in this case, I'm calling your bluff on that one, sir. I think this was two teams who'd had extremely taxing runs to the final, both running out of steam at the same time. And the winner was going to be whoever could hold it together the longest. And that was UConn. UConn won their third national title in program history. Kemba was voted player of the tournament and a first-team All-American, and an icon of March Madness history was born. But setting aside the ins and outs of these individual games, how did this happen? In a more big picture sense. I love this UConn team for a few reasons, but one of the main ones is that they went against a lot of conventional wisdom in how they won games. They weren't super deep, they didn't have a roster full of elite NBA prospects, and they didn't shoot a ton of threes. What they did have was a team that was built for tournament basketball. They were top 20 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. They had an elite upperclassman guard as their primary scorer, and they had a head coach in Jim Calhoun who'd been there before and won. You saw evidence of this from the first month of the season when they went to Maui. These guys had the right mix of characteristics to win tournaments, even if they didn't necessarily have the look of a dominant team more generally. And on that note, one of the most important jobs a coach or really any leader has is to try and get the most out of the people they're leading, and sometimes that requires some creative problem solving. To me, this season is one of the best examples of how one of the defining traits of a great coach is how well he or she is able to find solutions. Jim Calhoun had a team that was inexperienced, not super prolific offensively, and not very deep. So what did he do? It took a while, but he finally found a blend that mixed the inside game of Alex Oriaki and Charles Agwandu with the backcourt of Kemba, Jeremy Lamb, and Shabazz Napier. That was really hard for other teams to get past. And that's an important point. Finding what works is not always a fast process. But if you're patient and willing to try some things that don't work in order to find the ones that do, you can have a lot of success. But one solution that was there from the very beginning was the main character of this video, Kemba Walker. Researching for this video has once again brought me back to the idea of what a clutch player is. Because regardless of what your definition of that term is, I think you'd have a really hard time saying that Kemba isn't one of them. Psychologically speaking, our perception of clutchness is shaped heavily by individual moments, and Kemba had a whole bunch of those while he was at UConn. Going all the way back to his freshman season in 2009, Kemba showed a knack for popping up at big moments. Fast forward to 2011, and you see game-winning shots against Texas, Villanova, and Pittsburgh, among other clutch moments that led UConn to the title. But on a more macro scale, Kemba also fulfilled the definition of clutchness that I tend to gravitate towards, which is that clutch players don't get better in big moments, so much as they don't get worse as much. What you'd expect to see happen in a situation like this is a player's numbers drop when he or she starts going up against better competition consistently. But that's not what happened with Kemba. His performance dipped some when UConn went from non-conference play to their conference schedule, but he was still averaging 22 points per game in that period where he was worse. Everybody thinks of this 11-game stretch at the end of the season as the time where Kemba just went crazy, but in reality, it wasn't so much that he got hot, so much as he was just good the whole time and stayed that way. Clutch players are the ones who can maintain their high levels of performance, including moments of individual brilliance, regardless of who they're playing against or when they're playing them. And no one typifies that idea more than Kemba Walker. But that idea may actually be working against us. I started making this video with the goal of trying to answer the question of whether or not one player can carry a team to a tournament win. But what I have concluded from all this time and research is that Kemba Walker may have broken us. College basketball may be the one sport we have where one person actually can put the team on their back and take them to glory. I mean, we just went through an entire season's worth of evidence that supports that hypothesis. But just because it can happen doesn't mean that you should expect it to. The data seems to suggest that while having a star player is certainly useful, it may or may not be helpful in picking one team over another. A study by the Harvard Sports Analysis Collective showed that teams with elite scorers, which they define as players who score 20 or more points a game, perform no better against expectations than teams without elite scorers. They found something similar for a high usage rate, and an analysis by ESPN in 2020 showed that having a Wooden Award finalist, or even multiple finalists, wasn't a guarantee of tournament success either. which is confusing because the 2011 version of Kemba Walker fits into all three of those categories pretty comfortably, and we saw what happened with his team. So what do we do with that information? The short answer is kind of whatever you want. I think Kemba Walker has broken us a bit, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. If a team has a player like him who does have the ability to go off and do it consistently, yeah, that guy and his team might be able to do some serious damage in March, especially if he has other players around him who can complement his skills. You should definitely remember that for every Kemba Walker, there's a Jimmer Fredette or a Trae Young who are in similar situations and didn't win a national title, but the way our brains work, we tend to prioritize the one time that it did work that way over the ones where it didn't. So if you're filling out your bracket and you want to prioritize guys like Kemba, which is to say a high usage, high impact upperclassman guard, then do so with caution. But I do have a couple of potential options for you. From a pure numbers perspective, Drake's Bennett Sturts is averaging 19 points per game and leads the country in win shares, both of which compare pretty favorably to Kemba. My favorite guy is UC San Diego's Anua Tate Jones, who's a Division II transfer originally from New Zealand and is currently averaging 19, 6, and 4. You've also got your big-time guards on highly seeded teams, like Zakai Ziegler or Walter Clayton Jr., or the option that I would prefer to go with for personal reasons, Mark Sears. But the truth is that none of these guys are really good analogs for Kemba because players like him just don't come around that often. It's not that common for a team that is so clearly reliant on one player to lead them to victory to actually get that victory, which makes what happened in 2011 that much more special. For a number of different reasons, both statistical and otherwise, that team was an anomaly and deserves to be treated as such. Could lightning strike again in the future and another Kemba Walker carry their team to a national title? Sure, but I wouldn't bet on it. But the fact that it's so rare means that we should probably appreciate the one we had that much more. Hi everybody, my name is Will, and this is my channel, Student of the Game. We make video essays about sports psychology and culture. If you enjoyed this one, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like it, as well as responding with your favorite Kemba moment or March Madness moment in general in the comments. My videos are going to be a little less frequent over the next bit, partially because of other work stuff, but also because I've been working on a new project that I'll hopefully be able to announce and give y'all a little more information about pretty soon. I'm really excited about it, but it won't be ready until the beginning of May. I'm off to go work on that now, actually, so until next time, I'm Will, and this is Student of the Game. Bye.